Daytona Beach, January 24, 1937. The racecourse is hard-packed sand and a strip of highway, 4 miles of it, open ocean on one side and scrub on the other. A man named Ed Kretz lines up on an Indian Sport Scout, number 38, and rides 200 miles in conditions that would end most men's day in the first corner. He wins at an average speed of 73 miles an hour. He collects $300. He does not lose his composure once. Springfield, Massachusetts is the center of American motorcycling. Has been since before most of the men watching were born. It would not be for much longer. Indian had been building motorcycles in Springfield since 1901. That is not a marketing claim. That is 2 years before Harley-Davidson assembled their first engine in a shed in Milwaukee.
By the time the board track era began and crowds of 20,000 turned up to watch men dice at 100 miles an hour on banked wooden ovals, Indian was already the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. They did not get there by accident. In 1911, Indian sent a factory team to the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy. The TT was the most prestigious motorcycle race in existence, held on public roads over Snaefell Mountain, nearly 38 miles of it, and it belonged to the British. It had always belonged to the British. Oliver Godfrey, riding a factory Indian, finished first. His teammates Franklin and Morehouse finished second and third. A clean sweep. First, second, and third, taken by an American manufacturer on British soil in the most important race in the world. The British manufacturers went back to their drawing boards. That was the Indian way. They did not wait for the race to come to them.
Through the 1910s and 20s, the Springfield factory was the standard against which everything else was measured. The Scout, introduced in 1920, became the platform every serious racer wanted under him. Light, responsive, with a 42-degree V-twin that sat low in the frame and put power down in a way that felt honest. When Irwin Baker rode one from San Diego to New York in 11 days and 12 hours, setting a transcontinental record, it was not a stunt. It was a demonstration. By the early 30s, the Depression had taken most of the American motorcycle industry with it. Excelsior Henderson closed in 1931. 2 companies remained, and in 1934, those 2 companies sat down with the AMA to build a new racing formula from the wreckage of the old one. Class C was what came out of those conversations. Production-based machines, pump gas. Riders had to own their bikes. The idea was to make racing affordable, to grow the sport at the club level, to get ordinary men onto the track. The formula set a ceiling. Side valve engines could run up to 750 cubic centimeters. Overhead valve engines were capped at 500. Both Indian and Harley had 45 cubic inch side valve twins in their catalogs. The Sport Scout was ready. The formula fit the machine like it had been measured for it. What followed was a decade and a half of racing that people in the stands did not forget. Ed Kretz at Daytona, the Langhorne Dirt Oval in Pennsylvania, a 1-mile circle that ate tires and punished mistakes. The Springfield Mile at the Illinois State Fairgrounds, where the crowd packed in tight and the bikes came off the corners at speeds that made no sense for a dirt surface. Kretz won the inaugural Daytona 200. He went back every year until 1959, racing until he was 48 years old. He won at Laconia. He won at Langhorne twice. He was voted most popular rider in 1938 and again in 1948. The nickname Iron Man was not something a publicist invented. It came from the riders who watched him finish races they had to abandon. And then, in the years after the war, Indian found something even better than one great rider. They built a team. Bobby Hill, Bill Tooman, Ernie Beckman. They called them the Wrecking Crew, and the name was accurate. From 1950 through 1953, the 3 of them accumulated 14 AMA national victories between them. Hill won the national championship in 1951, then again in 1952, both times at the Springfield Mile. Tooman took it in 1953. 3 consecutive years, 3 different riders, 1 factory. A man watching that Springfield Mile in 1953 would have had no reason to believe what was coming. The bikes were fast.
The riders were the best in the country. The team was intact. The factory was already in its final year of production. The trouble had started before most people noticed it.
In 1945, a group led by Ralph B. Rogers purchased a controlling interest in Indian. Rogers was a young industrialist, successful, confident. He looked at the Springfield factory, 400,000 square feet of it, running at 5% capacity, and saw an opportunity. He was not wrong about that part. What he did next is where it went wrong. Rogers discontinued the Scout, the machine that Ed Kretz had ridden to national titles, the platform the Wrecking Crew would have built their careers on, was gone. Rogers wanted to compete with the British lightweight bikes that were beginning to appear in American dealerships. He wanted a new kind of customer. He introduced the Aero, a 220 cubic centimeter single, then the 249 Scout, a lightweight twin with an overhead valve engine. Neither machine had anything to do with what Indian riders had come to expect from Springfield. The new bikes were underdeveloped. They were rushed to market before the engineering was finished. Dealers who had spent years selling the Chief and the Scout now had showroom floors full of machines that broke and embarrassed them. The dealer network that had taken decades to build began to come apart. By 1949, production had nearly stopped. Rogers brought the Chief back in 1950 and then stepped down. John Brockhouse, an English industrialist, took over. He could not stop what Rogers had started. Production wound down through 1952. Most of the 1953 Chiefs were built from parts already in the warehouse. When those parts ran out, the line stopped. The Springfield factory went quiet in 1953, 52 years after the first Indian prototype turned a wheel. Here is the detail that does not appear in most accounts of this story. In 1954, the AMA launched a formal Grand National Championship Series, the series that would define American motorcycle racing for the next half-century. The first race of that series was held at Daytona. Bobby Hill won it. The same Bobby Hill who had carried the Indian Wrecking Crew to back-to-back national championships in 1951 and 1952. The man who had been the face of Springfield's dominance in its final years. He crossed the line first. He was riding a BSA. Indian had been closed for less than a year. The series that formalized everything the Wrecking Crew had built their careers on began the year after the factory shut down. Hill won the inaugural Grand National on a British machine because there was no longer an American one he could ride. The championship Indian had earned the right to compete for no longer had an Indian in it. The Class C rules that Indian and Harley had helped write in 1934 remained in place for 35 years. Side valve engines at 750 cubic centimeters. Overhead valve engines at 500.
That equivalency formula protected American flathead technology against the more modern British overhead valve twins that began flooding the market in the late 40s and through the 50s. BSA, Triumph, Norton, they could race, but they had to do it in 500 cubic centimeter machines, while the American flatheads ran 750. It was not a level field. By the middle of the 1960s, the formula had become impossible to defend. The side valve engine was obsolete. Nobody made flatheads anymore except Harley-Davidson, and even their engineers knew the design had reached its limit. British manufacturers came to the AMA in 1968 and pushed for a single displacement limit, no distinction by valve configuration. The AMA agreed. For 1969, overhead valve engines were cleared to run at 750 cubic centimeters. The formula that had governed American racing for a generation was gone. It was the right call. It was also 16 years too late for anyone in Springfield to care. The rules changed in 1969. Indian had closed in 1953. The factory that built the machines that made the formula worth having was not there to run the bikes that the new formula would finally have allowed them to build. The AMA fixed the race. They just fixed it after the team that needed it most had already packed up and gone home. What Indian lost in 1953 was not just a factory. It was a specific kind of knowledge.
the kind that lives in the hands of the men who build the same engine for 30 years and know without measuring when the tolerances are right. That knowledge does not transfer to a warehouse full of imported Royal Enfields with an Indian badge bolted on. It does not survive a decade of ownership changes and licensing deals and lawyers arguing over a name. What Springfield had built, from the first scout to the last chief, was a lineage.
The machine that Kretz rode in 1937 was a direct descendant of the bikes that swept the Isle of Man in 1911. The Wrecking Crew's Big Base Scouts in 1952 carried the same engineering logic that Charles Franklin had sketched before he died in 1932. It was one continuous conversation between riders and engineers, conducted over half a century, interrupted only by wars. Rogers ended that conversation when he discontinued the Scout, not because he was malicious, because he did not understand what he had. He saw a motorcycle company running at 5% capacity and thought the problem was the product line. The problem was not the product line. The brand that replaced Indian on the national circuit was not really a replacement. Harley-Davidson won 8 consecutive Grand National Championships after 1953, the series running without an American challenger worth naming until the British manufacturers finally got their displacement parity in 1969.
By then, the generation of riders who had grown up watching the Wrecking Crew work was already middle-aged. Bobby Hill retired in 1959. Bill Tooman hung up his leathers in 1955. Ernie Beckman was gone from the circuit not long after. They had won 14 national races between them, on machines built in a factory that no longer existed, competing in a formula that had been designed around engines nobody was making anymore. They had been the best riders in America, on the best American motorcycle, and the institution that was supposed to sustain all of that had walked away from its own product before they were finished with it. The iron was still there. The knowledge of how to build it, how to tune it, how to ride it, that survived in garages and back rooms and dealer shops from Springfield to California. The factory that made it mean something was gone.